On the morning of February 25, 1956, Nikita Khrushchev rose to address a closed session of the 20th Party Congress and delivered a speech that would shatter the carefully constructed mythology of Soviet power, sending tremors through every socialist state on Earth. The speech lasted nearly 4 hours, contained 70 pages of documentation, and systematically dismantled the cult of Joseph Stalin, who had died just 3 years earlier. What made the most powerful man in the Soviet Union decide to publicly denounce the leader who had built the very system that now sustained him? And how did this single act transform what it meant to live in Soviet Russia in 1956? The answer begins not in that hall in Moscow, but in the preceding 3 years of confusion, anxiety, and carefully choreographed uncertainty that followed Stalin's death in March 1953. For nearly 3 decades, Stalin had been the Soviet Union, his portrait in every factory, his words quoted to justify every policy, his approval required for decisions both monumental and trivial. Then suddenly he was gone, and the men who had survived his purges by perfecting the art of anticipating his moods now faced a vacuum more dangerous than any directive. They had to rule without the rulebook, to exercise power in a system designed for one man's will. Khrushchev emerged from this struggle not because he was the obvious successor, but precisely because he seemed the least threatening, a round-faced former coal miner from Ukraine who spoke with a provincial accent and lacked the cold elegance of Beria or the administrative pedigree of Malenkov. But Khrushchev understood something his rivals missed. The system Stalin built was eating itself. The Gulag held millions, including engineers the economy desperately needed. Agricultural production stagnated because collective farm chairmen feared making decisions without permission from above. And permission rarely came because mid-level bureaucrats feared taking responsibility for anything. Factory managers met production quotas by producing exactly what the plan specified, even when what the plan specified made no economic sense, because innovation without authorization could be classified as sabotage. The terror had not produced efficiency. It had produced paralysis wrapped in frantic activity. Someone had to break the cycle, and Khrushchev calculated that breaking it would consolidate his power, while his rivals clung to Stalinist orthodoxy. He was gambling that enough people in the apparatus wanted to stop glancing over their shoulders every morning, wondering if today was the day the midnight knock would come. If you want to understand how these calculations played out in real time, how the machinery of Soviet power actually functioned when forced to reinvent itself, you should subscribe now, because we dig into the mechanisms behind the headlines, the decisions that shaped daily life under systems most documentaries simplify into slogans. The speech itself was classified as secret, delivered only to Soviet delegates with party credentials, but secrecy in a system of 50,000 attendees is theatrical at best. Within weeks, copies circulated through party cells across the Soviet Union, read aloud in closed meetings to trusted members who were simultaneously told the information was not for distribution and expected to understand its implications for their work. The contradictions were deliberate. Khrushchev needed the speech's content to spread without taking full responsibility for spreading it, needed to signal change without chaos, needed to dismantle Stalin's authority without admitting the party itself had been wrong. This was de-Stalinization as bureaucratic maneuver, revolution as memo. What did the speech actually say? It detailed executions of old Bolsheviks on fabricated evidence, torture of confessions from loyal communists, military disasters Stalin caused by ignoring intelligence and purging competent officers before the Nazi invasion, deportations of entire ethnic groups, and the cultivation of a personality cult that violated Leninist principles. Khrushchev did not condemn collectivization or the broader structure of Soviet socialism. He condemned excesses, deviations, violations of socialist legality. The framing mattered enormously. Stalin had not been wrong in principle but in practice, not ideologically but personally. This allowed Khrushchev to position himself as restoring true Leninism rather than admitting systematic failure, to liberate prisoners without calling them innocents, to close some camps without acknowledging why camps existed at all. The speech reached the West within months, probably leaked through Polish or Yugoslav channels, and the CIA distributed it widely, but the real audience was domestic, and the real question was how Soviet citizens would interpret permission to criticize what had been mandatory to worship. In Moscow, university students gathered in dormitories to debate what the revelations meant, conversations that months earlier would have ended in expulsions or worse. In Leningrad, writers began submitting poems and stories they had kept in desk drawers for years, testing new limits in real time. In the Gulag camps themselves, prisoners heard rumors of the speech before guards did, and the rumors arrived as questions. If Stalin was wrong, what did that make their sentences? What did it make the guards who enforced them? Releases began that spring and accelerated through the summer. Not everyone, not all at once, but enough to overwhelm the processing capacity of a bureaucracy unprepared for reverse deportations. Prisoners who had survived Kolyma gold mines or Vorkuta coal pits returned to cities where their old apartments housed new families, where their old jobs had been filled a decade ago, where relatives had stopped mentioning their names. They arrived without documents, without the internal passports required to legally reside in major cities, without ration cards or employment authorization. Local officials had no protocols for this. The system had detailed procedures for arresting people, transporting them, working them, burying them. It had no procedures for unarresting them. Many returnees found themselves in a bizarre limbo, legally free but bureaucratically non-existent, ghosts petitioning for reinstatement to life. Meanwhile, the economy Khrushchev inherited demanded immediate attention. 1956 was the year the sixth five-year plan was supposed to accelerate industrial growth and finally deliver on promises of consumer goods that had been deferred since the revolution. Soviet citizens had endured collectivization, purges, war, and reconstruction on the promise that sacrifice today meant prosperity tomorrow. Tomorrow kept receding. In 1956, the average urban family still lived in communal apartments, sharing kitchens and bathrooms with 3 or 4 other families. Privacy, a bourgeois concept remembered by the elderly and rejected by propaganda but quietly desperately desired by nearly everyone. Khrushchev promised housing, real housing, individual apartments for families, and launched the most ambitious construction program in Soviet history. Prefabricated concrete panel buildings rose on city outskirts, 5 stories tall because that was the maximum height requiring no elevator, cheaply built but genuinely new. An answer to the housing crisis that was also an answer to the question of what de-Stalinization delivered beyond speeches. But the Khrushchev buildings, as they were already being called, represented more than construction. They represented a shift in the social contract. Stalin had demanded sacrifice for future utopia, emphasis on future, emphasis on collective abstraction. Khrushchev promised tangible improvement now, in your lifetime, for you personally. This was ideologically risky. If socialism justified itself through better living standards rather than historical inevitability, then living standards became the measure of legitimacy, and legitimacy became empirically testable. Khrushchev was betting he could deliver growth fast enough to satisfy rising expectations. He himself was encouraging. The bet assumed continued industrial expansion, technological advancement keeping pace with the West, and agricultural productivity finally matching propaganda. Each assumption would be tested, and most would fail. But in 1956, the program was new enough to generate genuine optimism. That optimism collided with events in Eastern Europe that Khrushchev had not predicted and could not control. The secret speech, as it was universally known despite never being officially published in the Soviet Union, reached Warsaw and Budapest with explosive force. If Stalin had been wrong, if Soviet leaders now admitted terrible crimes committed in socialism's name, then perhaps the entire Moscow-imposed order was negotiable. In June, workers in Poznan, Poland, struck over wages and economic conditions, and the strikes became demonstrations, and the demonstrations became riots demanding political change. Polish security forces killed dozens. The unrest forced Moscow to accept Władysław Gomulka, a communist previously imprisoned for nationalist deviation, as Polish leader in October. Khrushchev flew to Warsaw unannounced with a delegation and Soviet tanks moved toward the city, but ultimately he accepted Gomulka, calculating that a nationalist communist Poland was preferable to a Poland in open revolt. Hungary watched Poland negotiate greater autonomy and wanted the same. Student demonstrations in Budapest on October 23 began peacefully, demanding reform, freedom of press, withdrawal of Soviet troops. By evening, the statue of Stalin in the city center was toppled. The state radio building was under siege, and security police were firing into crowds. Within days, Soviet tanks entered Budapest, then withdrew after negotiations installed Imre Nagy, a reformist communist, as prime minister. Nagy promised free elections and began releasing political prisoners. On November 1st, he announced Hungary's withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact and declared neutrality. This crossed the line Khrushchev could not allow crossed. A communist state leaving the bloc was not negotiable autonomy but existential threat. If Hungary could leave, the entire Eastern European structure could unravel, and with it the buffer zone purchased with 20 million Soviet lives in the war against fascism. Soviet forces invaded Hungary on November 4th with overwhelming force. Thousands died in the fighting, many of them students and workers who built barricades believing the West would intervene. The West expressed sympathy and did nothing, consumed by the Suez Crisis and unwilling to risk war over Soviet internal matters, which is how Washington classified the invasion of a sovereign state. Nagy took refuge in the Yugoslav embassy and was later arrested despite promises of safe conduct, eventually executed in 1958. The invasion succeeded militarily and failed ideologically. It demonstrated that de-Stalinization had limits enforced by tank columns, that the Soviet Union would tolerate reform only within parameters it controlled, that the international communist movement's unity was maintained through force when persuasion failed. Back in Moscow, Khrushchev faced criticism from hardliners who argued de-Stalinization had unleashed chaos he could not manage. Molotov, Stalin's old foreign minister, demanded a return to discipline. Khrushchev survived the criticism partly because the Hungarian intervention proved he would use force when necessary, partly because he consolidated support among regional party secretaries whose power depended on the new order he was building. The contradictions were obvious but not necessarily fatal. Liberalize at home while crushing liberalization abroad, denounce terror while employing it strategically, promise socialist legality while reserving exceptions for state security. For ordinary Soviet citizens in 1956, these contradictions played out in daily life as confusing new permissions layered over familiar prohibitions. You could now criticize Stalin's cult of personality, but not the party's leading role. You could read books previously banned, but only those the censors decided illustrated correct criticism of past errors. You could listen to jazz on Voice of America broadcasts, and the authorities might look the other way, or they might not, and the uncertainty itself was the control mechanism. The thaw, as writers called this period, was not spring but February, cold lessening but winter not over, ice melting in unpredictable patches that might bear weight or might not. Literature became the testing ground for these new limits. In October, a small literary journal called Novi Mir published a short novel titled Not by Bread Alone by Vladimir Dudintsev. The book criticized careerist bureaucrats who suppressed innovation to protect their positions, who valued ideological conformity over technical competence, who punished engineers for proposing improvements that might imply current methods were inadequate. This was explosive, not because it revealed unknown truths, but because it printed in official publication what everyone knew from experience, but could not previously say aloud. The print run sold out immediately. Demand overwhelmed supply so dramatically that people copied passages by hand to share with friends, transforming an officially sanctioned novel into samizdat through sheer appetite for permitted criticism. The cultural bureaucracy panicked. Conservative critics denounced Dudintsev for slandering Soviet society, for giving ammunition to enemies, for forgetting party guidance in pursuit of sensation. But enough powerful figures defended the book that it could not be fully suppressed, only criticized and restricted. The debate itself mattered more than the outcome. That debate could occur in public, in journals, with genuine disagreement expressed without everyone on the losing side being arrested, represented change measurable in decibels of argument. Meanwhile, the Virgin Lands campaign consumed resources and attention in a gamble almost as risky as de-Stalinization. Khrushchev had ordered the plowing of 40 million hectares of previously uncultivated land in Kazakhstan and western Siberia, an area larger than the entire cultivated land of Canada. Hundreds of thousands of young volunteers and not-so-volunteers were dispatched to new state farms carved from steppe, promised adventure and contribution to the motherland, delivered to landscapes of stunning emptiness where housing was tents and sanitation was improvised, and the growing season was brutally short. The first harvests in 1954 and 55 were decent, largely due to favorable weather. 1956 brought drought to many regions and wind erosion to marginal lands plowed without adequate understanding of steppe ecology. The campaign would continue and yields would vary wildly, but the pattern was established. Hasty implementation of ambitious schemes based more on will than expertise, short-term successes celebrated as permanent victories, long-term consequences deferred or denied. Khrushchev's method was to launch campaigns, to mobilize energy through enthusiasm rather than terror, to replace fear with optimism as the motivating force of Soviet society. This was genuinely different from Stalinism and genuinely unstable. Enthusiasm is harder to direct than fear and exhausts itself faster. The volunteers ploughing the virgin lands believed in what they were doing in 1954. By 1956, many wanted to go home. The students debating Dudintsev's novel believed literature could change society. Within years, many would conclude that permitted criticism only reinforced what could not be changed. The released prisoners believed rehabilitation meant justice. They learned it often meant a stamped document and continued suspicion. Yet the changes mattered. The Gulag population, which had reached nearly 2.5 million under Stalin, dropped to under a million by the end of 1956. Millions returned from internal exile. The number of executions fell dramatically. Arbitrary arrests did not cease but became less arbitrary, more targeted, constrained by some recognition that mass terror damaged the economy and delegitimized the system internationally. This was not the rule of law, but it was the reduction of lawlessness, a distinction that meant everything to those who would have been arrested under the old rules and were not under the new. In the realm of technology and education, Soviet achievements in 1956 laid groundwork for successes that would shock the West. Investment in technical education produced a generation of highly trained scientists and engineers. The Soviet nuclear program, which had tested its first hydrogen bomb in 1953, continued advancing. Rocket development accelerated under Sergei Korolev, whose design bureau was preparing vehicles that would launch Sputnik into orbit the following year. Soviet science benefited from state commitment to prestige projects, from concentration of resources that capitalist economies allocated through markets, and from genuine talent drawn to fields where politics interfered least. A physicist could not easily be accused of ideological deviation if his equations matched experimental results, though of course some were accused anyway, and the freedom was relative and contingent. Internationally, Khrushchev pursued what he called peaceful coexistence with capitalism, arguing that competition between systems would prove socialism's superiority without war. This was partly genuine belief and partly necessity. The Soviet Union had nuclear weapons but far fewer than the United States, and Soviet cities had no defense against American bombers. Peaceful coexistence allowed shifting resources from military to civilian production while maintaining ideological competition. It meant summits and cultural exchanges and propaganda battles fought with economic statistics and space achievements, rather than only proxy wars and espionage, though those continued too. The contradictions were features, not bugs. Cooperate and compete, trade and threaten, visit American farms to study corn cultivation while supporting insurgencies against American allies. For the average person in Soviet Russia in 1956, daily life remained defined by shortage, substitution, and queue. Meat was rationed in many cities or simply unavailable for weeks. Clothing quality was poor and choice limited, fashion a capitalist decadence in theory, and a quiet obsession in practice. The emerging black market responded to gaps between official economy and actual demand, trading goods stolen from state warehouses, foreign items obtained through murky channels, services the plan did not provide because the plan could not anticipate individual need. Engaging with this market was illegal and universal. Another contradiction that ordinary people navigated with the same skill they applied to navigating contradictory permissions in politics. You learned which rules were enforced and which were performed, which transgressions merited punishment and which merited looking the other way. Housing construction could not keep pace with demand despite the ambitious programs. Waiting lists for apartments stretched years, and allocation depended on bureaucratic favor, family size, employment sector, and connections. The communal apartment remained the norm, a peculiarly Soviet institution where private life occurred in single rooms and common space became a theater of petty conflicts over kitchen schedules and bathroom access and whose laundry occupied which drying line. The walls were thin and neighbors informed on neighbors, sometimes for ideological conviction and sometimes for advantage in the queue for housing or goods or jobs. Trust was calibrated carefully, intimacy rationed like meat. Yet within these constraints, people built lives. They married and raised children and celebrated holidays. They read poetry aloud in kitchens and listened to forbidden radio stations under blankets and debated in whispers what the secret speech meant for their futures. They worked in factories and schools and hospitals, some with genuine commitment to building socialism and some merely surviving and most doing both at different times or simultaneously. The system demanded performance of belief and most performed it adequately, while reserving private thoughts for trusted friends or for no one. 1956 was the year some people began to hope that the performance might become less mandatory, that the gap between public speech and private thought might narrow. This channel exists because viewers like you support independent research into how these systems actually function beyond the propaganda. If you value this work, you can support it through the Ko-fi link in the description. Khrushchev's gamble in 1956 was that he could manage controlled liberalization, that he could release pressure without exploding the boiler, that he could modernize the Soviet system while maintaining its fundamental structure. He succeeded in ending the worst of Stalinist terror and failed to create a stable alternative. The reforms were real, and the limits were non-negotiable, and the tension between them would define Soviet life until the system collapsed 3 decades later. Hungary proved that autonomy extended only as far as Moscow's tanks were willing to travel. The secret speech proved that truth could be spoken, but only certain truths, only in certain ways, only when power permitted. The returning prisoners proved that justice could be corrected but not fully acknowledged, that innocence could be restored on paper but not in fact. The year 1956 was not a turning point that turned smoothly, but a pivot that ground against resistance, that changed direction while carrying forward the momentum of everything that came before. The people who lived through it experienced not liberation but complication, not freedom but degrees of constraint, not answers but the recognition that questions previously forbidden could now be asked even if answers remained elusive. They inhabited a system learning to rule through managed uncertainty rather than pure terror, through selective permission rather than total prohibition, through the exhausting work of calibrating exactly how much truth could be spoken before silence became mandatory again. That exhaustion and that calibration, that daily navigation of shifting boundaries, was what Soviet Russia was like in 1956, and it was both genuinely different from what came before and genuinely continuous with the structures that survived every reform.